This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. What would you do with one extra day off each week? Would you take a class, spend time with your kids, catch up on chores? Experts say we use extra time off in all sorts of ways. Today, we're talking about the 4-day work week. Back in March, U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders introduced legislation for a 32-hour work week without any loss in pay. We revisit this topic today and explore other solutions that can give people more of their time back. And we want to hear from you. What's your schedule like in the office? Would you rather work a 4-day week? Let us know, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And joining us today to talk about the 4-day work week and other solutions is Alex Pang. He's a director of research and innovation at 4-Day Week Global, and the latest edition of his book, Rest, came out in January. Thank you so much, Alex, for being with us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
And also with us is Lynne Vincent, who's an associate professor of management at the Whitman School of Management at Syracuse University. Lynne, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me with you.
And also with us is Robert Bird, who's a professor of business law at the School of Business at the University of Connecticut. Robert, thanks for being with us today as well.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Alex, I want to start with you because we've had you on the show before to talk about the 4-day work week, which was about 2 years ago, I believe. And that felt like a sort of a new idea, like a pipe dream at the time. But it seems like more and more companies are either thinking about this or are actually adopting this. So can you tell us, what have you seen so far?
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right, Catherine, that sort of the adoption of the 4-day week is continuing to expand, to grow, and that we're seeing it appear in a wider range of kinds of places. So if at the beginning of the movement, it was more kind of knowledge-intensive creative service firms or places like Michelin-starred restaurants that could kind of defy the normal laws of economic gravity that hold in most places. These days, what we're seeing is places like nursing homes or nurse managers in big hospitals, or even a police department in Colorado, trialing shorter work weeks without cutting people's salaries or cutting expectations around level of service delivery or output. And so I think that along with that, there also is a kind of diversification in the ways that people are working 4-day weeks. So shifting not from a model mainly of, Fridays off and a 3-day weekend to something to a whole range of more complex ways of doing this. And then finally, the conversation, I think, is much less around kind of philosophical questions of, is this possible to, in my industry, with my people and these conditions, how could I make it work? And so it's really about thinking through the details and the practicalities now, rather than, is this something that's going to work or is it something that's beneficial? Because we know the answer to both of those is yes.
And we definitely want to dig deeper in terms of, what works for what industry, because we know this is not a one-size-fits-all situation, but we'll definitely get into that in a little bit. But I want to get to Robert real quick here, too, because, we're talking about the 4-day work week as if it's kind of a semi-new idea, but it really isn't. This is something that started in the 70s, right?
That's right. This is not a new idea. This is not the first time the 4-day work week has been attempted. In the 1970s, there was great optimism about transitioning to a 4-day work week. There was even a phrase during that time, "Thank God it's Thursday." And the press reported it as an inevitability. Companies were switching quickly to the 4-day work week, trying to get ahead of what they expected to be a mandated requirement for the workplace. However, that movement in the 1970s, which seemed so inevitable, fizzled as quickly as it arose. Companies encountered significant problems regarding scheduling. They found they weren't able to satisfy their customer needs as well. And employees found that they had to engage in scheduling challenges, trying to make sure that the company had all its needs met, while also trying to maintain a 4-day work week. And that movement fizzled away. And by 1980, most of the firms that had tried the 4-day work week returned to a 5-day work week schedule. Now, 2024 is so much different. There's been great changes in technology. There's changes in employee voice and employee power. And we have remote work in a way that was not even conceivable 50 years ago. So today, I think we can have some optimism about the 4-day work week, that it's going to take root that we might not have had in the 1970s.
Well, I was going to say, thank God it's Thursday. TGIT doesn't quite roll off the tongue yet, but it could still happen. And Alex, with what Robert just built for us, I mean, when we think about the 4-day work week, we were just talking about, this could mean something different for different companies and different industries. And we mentioned earlier that Senator Bernie Sanders has proposed a 32-hour work week. But, some workplaces are adopting 4-10s, so 4 10-hour work days. So can you talk about, what are you seeing in terms of the different models? Is one model better than the other?
You know, short answer to one model better than the other, no. I mean, in the sense that you've got very different kinds of organizations with different working conditions and demands of experimenting with this. And you do see 4 10-hour days as something that companies that are a little more cautious will try, because it feels like it's clearer that if you move kind of squares around on the calendar, you still have the same amount of time from employees, and so you can get the same work done.
Right.
But we're seeing a kind of diversification of, for example, sort of researchers or developers working for 8-hour days and having 3 days off, while the sales team, which always wants to be available for calls, will do 5 days, working, let's say, 6-hour days, and just making sure that they're available at the times when people are most likely to or try and contact them. So that's the kind of sort of variety that we're seeing, and it's definitely not one size fits all. And companies are showing great ingenuity in thinking through sort of different ways of reducing work weeks and sort of reducing work time now.
And I mean, so of course this is so different for different people, but does working 4 10-hour days negate the point of a 4-day work week?
I think it comes down to whether you like having 3 days off more
Mm,
than you dislike the longer shifts. And so unfortunately, there's not as much hard and fast research that sort of compares, similar companies doing this, using those two different models. But I think that the personal preference sort of comes down to, do you like 3 days off, or are you, more than you are exhausted by the end of the long day?
mm. I mean, that definitely makes sense. And with the different industries, and I know you mentioned a little bit earlier that there seems to be one sector of the workforce that is more open to this, which are emergency services and nonprofits. So jobs like nursing and even people who work in food insecurity, for example. So are you surprised at all to see sort of these sectors of the workforce adapting to to this kind of schedule?
To be honest, Catherine, I am sort of consistently amazed at what the organizations we work with are able to do. I mean, I think that it's easy to envision how a creative services firm might be able to do this. But the fact that we've got nonprofits, that we have social service agencies, law firms, right, where the
Mm,
billable hour reigns supreme,
right.
these places have figured out how to make it work. And I think it's a, so I am always amazed, but very positively so.
And Lynn, I want to talk about workers and employees and productivity sort of in a typical 5-day work week. Of those average 40 hours worked, how much time is really spent productively, you would say, Lynn?
There have been studies that have shown that people report that they have productive work for 20 hours a week. So 20 hours and not 40. And the rest of it is spent shifting tasks or doing things that they don't think are meaningful or productive.
And I think from your conversations, you've also mentioned the phrase microtask or maybe unengaged work. Can you talk about, what does that mean, microtasks?
So microtasks are those small tasks that require you to shift attention away from your primary task. So I'm a researcher. If I could be conducting a statistical analysis or working on a paper, and then all of a sudden my email notification pops up and I hear that ding, and I have that cognitive pressure to shift over, check my email, stop what I'm doing, go respond. And then it's the process of coming back to my primary work. Like, wait, what was I saying? What was I doing? What was my point there? And it adds up. All of that loss of productivity, all that shifting, it takes time away.
And I think another fairly new element, I think, with this conversation is there are a lot of people out there talking about using AI to make some work tasks a bit more streamlined, or just to help with crossing off some of our tasks. So, can you talk about, are there examples of what can be streamlined through AI?
I've seen a lot of organizations doing like initial service emails, taking care of form emails, doing some customer service where an AI bot will take the initial information and then shift it over to the right area. So instead of a human sorting it, it's a bot sorting it. But AI is becoming a lot more flexible in what it can do, and it's becoming higher quality work. So we're going to be seeing more organizations implementing it in their daily tasks.
And I think one of your biggest focuses is on creativity and productivity. And so, how does the 4-day work week impact creativity and productivity? You would say.
I think it has the potential of being extremely beneficial. So creativity is hard. It takes a lot of cognitive effort to generate novel and useful ideas, and then expand upon those ideas, and then evaluate them, select them, figure out how to implement them. There is a lot of cognitive load there, and it's a high amount of rejection and failure. So it's not an easy task, so people can become burned out. So having a little bit of time to step back, process, and then be able to come back to the task in a more rejuvenated way, it could be very beneficial. There's another part there. If our minds are already always working.
Right.
So if we step away from our desks for a while, we go do something else, our minds are still working on that creative idea, even if we are not aware that it is. So if we give our minds and give our bodies time for introspection, time for the subconscious processes to process, we could see more creativity.
And Alex, of course, as we've talked about, there's so many elements here in terms of who can adopt this and who can go about doing this. But I think one of the big questions that we're all wondering is, if this is adopted, whichever model we go with, would this mean an adjustment, or even a reduction in salary?
The companies that we have worked with have shown that you can reduce working hours without cutting salaries, as long as you sort of don't change expectations around productivity or output or kind of level of professional service. And so I think that and indeed one of the big questions that you always get when you talk about rolling this out is this just a stealth way of either reducing salaries or reducing headcount or demanding more out of workers? And so far, it hasn't been used that way, which I think is mainly a function of the fact that lots of the business owners who have done this have wanted a 4-day week for themselves, because they are facing the same kinds of challenges with burnout and overwork and work-life balance that everybody else is. And moving their entire organizations is a way of giving them permission to rest a little bit more and helping create a kind of structure that helps keep them accountable.
And Robert, we have to talk about what this legally means, because we know employee hours and what's considered full-time is regulated by the Department of Labor. So can you tell us, what would it mean to reduce full-time from 40 hours to 32 hours?
Sure. There are some legal implications. Most prominently is the Fair Labor Standards Act, which requires employees to be paid, certain qualified employees to be paid 1.5 times their regular rate for hours worked over 40 hours in a work week. And the Fair Labor Standard Act was meant to protect a certain class of workers to ensure that they received overtime pay under certain conditions. This act was created for an environment where you had a 5-day, 40-hour work week. If businesses reduce that time to 4 days a week, working 32 hours in a different week, that Fair Labor Standards Act threshold for overtime pay remains a little bit out of reach for employees because the standard of work has changed and the amount of hours have shortened. And I want to agree with what Alex had said, is that when a company has transitioned to a 4-day work week, they generally have not seen increased costs of a substantial amount. Individuals tend to be more productive, employees tend to be more engaged, and they tend to be more effective while they're there. Other laws that may be relevant is that the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires employers to provide a reasonable accommodation to employees in order to perform essential functions of their job. Some employees may experience fatigue working at the 9th or 10th hour of a workday, and businesses may have to work with their employees who do experience that fatigue to provide an appropriate accommodation. Collective bargaining agreements may also be impacted. Unions may bargain for certain working time schedules, and that can also shape how the workplace functions. So there are some legal implications that exist in making this transition, but none of these legal issues are insurmountable. And I think they can all be managed by an organization who is committed to the 4-day work week, sees the benefit of the 4-day work week, and realizes that it's a gain not only for employees, but employers as well.
Well, and with what you just shared too, and especially since it feels like the conversations on this I mean, it's been happening for a while, as we've talked about, and it's ongoing, and we're hearing about legislation being introduced to implement this. So what would you say would take to make this sort of the norm across the country? Because I think based on everything that all three of you have said, it sounds like society is ready for a modified work schedule. Robert?
Sure. I think society is more ready than ever. Right, we have technology that allows us to work at home. COVID has created a fundamental shift in how we approach work, which we can talk more about. And people realize that they don't have to work a standard 9 to 5 schedule. And because employees are more aware of this opportunity, and because I think employees are more desiring this opportunity, because we are increasingly time crunched. There's so much that we want to accomplish in a given week. We have personal issues. We're taking care of loved ones. We want to attend school events for our children. That the more employees recognize that a 4-day work week is viable, and the more that employees recognize that a 4-day work week is something that would be a benefit overall, I think you're going to see a movement towards this change. And where will this movement come from? Most likely states that have been traditionally leaders in employment legal innovations. And the one that immediately comes to mind is California. California has some of the most strongest protections for employees in the United States, California state law. And there have been bills introduced in California to change to a 4-day work week and institutionalize that 4-day work week. Other states have tried as well. We haven't seen success yet. But if this becomes a prominent issue for American voters, that's when you're going to see legislation starting to change.
And with that sort of, sounds like a slow process, but the process is sort of ongoing, I think. Is there a big difference when it comes to hourly employees versus salary employees, for example?
Yes, there is a difference. The Fair Labor Standards Act, which I discussed previously, generally applies to what we call non-exempt employees. These are employees that generally work on a wage. They have an hourly wage. There's a certain type of work, and overtime implications, I think, are more directly applicable to them. Those that are salaried workers, who we consider to be exempt employees, to which the Fair Labor Standards Act does not apply, this will be more of a cultural change. Employers will have to say, we are interested in a 4-day, 40-hour work week, and we don't want you to work those extra hours. It'll be tempting for employees to try to get ahead, to attach to their phones, to respond to workplace concerns. So it takes a real commitment, especially in the salaried workplace, for employers to say, this truly is a 4-day week workplace. And I think in the long run, companies will witness benefits. Employees will have greater organizational citizenship. They'll take the organization's interest above their own when working in the workplace. They'll be more refreshed. They'll be more productive, more creative, as Lynne mentioned, and also more engaged generally. So it's a different group versus these exempt and non-exempt workers and how it will be impacted. And there's always a risk that an innovation in the workplace will benefit those who have the most bargaining power, those generally who receive the highest wages, and hurt those that have the least bargaining powers, those that are really suffering from what we call a time poverty. Their schedule was not their own. They're called into work at almost any time. And we need to make sure that whenever a 4-day work week is implemented, those workers with the least bargaining power are fully protected.
Today we're
Alex said,
really quickly, go for it.
Alex said earlier that it's not a one size fits all. And I think that's
Right.
what Robert's getting at is it's not a one size fits all, but we do need different sizes because this one size is not fitting us at all.
Right. And we will be continuing to talk about, what are the sizes available for all of the sizes that are out there. Today, we're talking about the workplace, remote work, burnout, and solutions to give workers more work-life balance. And if you were to have one extra day off during the week, let us know, what would it be? I would have to say either Friday or Monday, so I get 3 days in a row. But our producer, Tess, says she's rather Wednesday in the middle of the week to decompress, which also makes sense to me, I think. And we also got a comment from Chuck on Facebook who says, I worked as a salaried lab researcher at a major pharma company in Connecticut. The company had a policy called Summer Fridays. If you worked 9 hours a day, you would get every other Friday off during the summer months. Eventually, the policy was rolled back when management realized most employees worked at least 9 hours a day year-round. Since then, I've moved on to a new career. I currently work 11-hour shifts, 7 days on, 7 days off, and I love it. Well, thank you so much, Chuck, for sharing your experience with us. Listeners, you can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. More people than ever have a hybrid work schedule, part-time in the office and part-time at home. Nearly 40% of hybrid workers can set their own schedule. That's according to a Gallup poll. So why are we still so burnt out? And what can we do about it? Many offices are now searching for solutions for better work-life balance, including a 4-day work week. And still with us is our panel of experts, Alex Pang, who's the Director of Research and Innovation at 4-Day Week Global, Lynne Vincent, who's an Associate Professor of Management with Syracuse University, and Robert Bird, who's a Professor of Business Law with UConn. And you can also join the conversation. Let us know if you have any questions or if you'd like to share your own work experience, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Alex, we've been talking a lot about scheduling changes and adopting, new sort of policy when it comes to work schedules. So, whenever any changes happen, workers have to adjust. So, can you talk about how do people adjust from having to fit in all of their work in a 5-day work week into a 4-day work week?
Well, the first thing is to go back to sort of Lynn's point about the number of hours that people spend sort of engaged productively in work.
Right.
So in a sense, what we have is a situation right now where the 4-day week is actually already here. It's just buried underneath of outmoded processes and overly long meetings and technology distractions. And so if you can get a handle on those things, then you can go a long way to making it possible to do in 4 days, sort of what it currently takes you 5. I think for, in other cases, the situation is a little bit different with, for example, Van Smith, which is a van conversion company in Colorado that moved to 4-day weeks. That was a lot more about individual sort of workers figuring out how to do some of sort of their design tasks or sort of execution a little more efficiently, as well as working together to figure out how to sort of work at the same time, sort of on a van without getting in everybody's way or creating interruptions. And that leads to the other really important adjustment, which is that this is something that companies and people do collectively, right? It's not about every individual making themselves 20% more efficient on their own, but rather working together to implement new norms around meetings or the way that you think about time or carving out parts of the day or the week for deep focus time versus time where it's okay to have meetings. And so all of those things together are sort of what you need to do in order to make this work. But it definitely is an adjustment, right? People, the first month or so, talk about it's a little bit like moving to a foreign country. People are all of a sudden you're driving on the wrong side of the road and the money feels strange and habits are different. But as with anything, after a little while, it starts to feel sort of familiar and very often starts to feel really sort of pretty good as an accomplishment.
Well, and it almost sounds like it's sort of building new habits, right? The transition can always be tricky, but once you're used to it, it might be smoother. And as we talk about burnout in the 5-day work week, Lynn, I want to ask, is there any risk of burnout in a 4-day work week? Because I think it sounds like it's a mix of cramming a lot of things into a limited amount of time and also trying to carve out time at the same time here.
Yes, but I think it depends on the implementation of the 4-day work week that people are using. If you are trying to do everything you did in a 40-hour work week or a 48-hour work week in less time, then yes, you are going to have burnout. That's job enlargement, not job enrichment. However, if people do the research and analyze what they do and look at it from a task-based perspective, not a time-based perspective, they can figure out what tasks do I need to do, when should I do them, and how can I make that process more efficient. It's not about the time that I'm sitting at my desk. It's what I'm doing at my desk. And that's the perspective that employees and employers need to use. What are the tasks that need to be done rather than the time?
Catherine, can I add quickly?
Go for it.
We've done surveys with in 4-day week companies asking about this kind of thing. And one of the really interesting results that you see is generally they do say that burnout levels go down. And that this seems to be attributed to two things. One is, as sort of Lynn suggested, sort of making better choices about the work that you're doing. Sometimes sometimes difficult choices and excluding stuff that's less important. The other thing, though, is that when you move to a 4-day week, and you're given the independence to figure out how to make this work with yourself and your team, people feel a greater control over their time. And that's one of the things that makes it feel less stressful. So we had one company that did a survey 6 months into its trial, and it found that the percentage of people who said, I have enough time to get all my work done, went from about 50% to 80%, even when they were cutting one day out of the work week. And I think that shows you that sort of if you give people control over their time, control over how they work, then that goes a long way to giving them a sense of, reducing their sort of levels of sort of stress and sort of reducing the likelihood that they're going to burn out.
Right. And Lynn, we talked about earlier too, just like not everyone can work remotely if this model gets adopted, it also doesn't mean that everyone will be able to work a 4-day work week. So how should we consider questions of justice and equity when we're thinking about the 4-day work week here?
I think those questions are fundamentally important because there are going to be equity issues. I think for knowledge workers, these solutions, that 4-day work week is much easier. I think for men, it's probably a bit easier. I think for women who do a larger amount of the care in families, the 4-day work week is a bit more challenging because you're always going to have those care requirements.
And
sorry. Yeah. Go.
So amplifying what you said, and that's exactly right, that the 4-day work week has the potential to be a gendered effect. And there have been some studies that have shown that when men receive time off to recharge, they use that time off to recharge. When women receive time off to recharge, they using it to take care of family responsibilities or other obligations that they have outside of work. Now, each family is different and each couple manages things differently, but there is the risk that a 4-day work week could enable men to receive a greater benefits from their leisure time than women. So I think this question about gender and its impact on the 4-day work week that Lynne has just mentioned is a very important one.
Yeah. Though, one of the things that we do see with the surveys is that because everybody is doing it together within the workplace, one of the things that seems to happen is that some of the gender disparities around time or what sociologists call the flexibility stigma, which is the sense that someone who moves to a flexible schedule maybe is not as professional as the person who sleeps at their desk. All of that goes away. And so, when flexibility or a shorter work week becomes something that everybody works together to achieve, then it becomes a win-win, as opposed to something that is for which people are have suspicions cast on them over. And then I think that it is that they're quite right that there is the possibility that that time can get spent differently and unequally. So far, I think what we're seeing is that people do amazingly wholesome things and healthy things with the time that they have off, and that it's it is still maybe unique enough so that there are so that people both genders are benefiting from their leisure time without significant inequalities emerging, at least yet.
And Robert, I want to follow with you really quickly too about the justice and equity question earlier, related to hourly and salaried workers. Can you talk about that, expand on that a little bit more?
Sure, I can. And this amplifies what Alex just talked about, the importance of control in the workplace.
Right.
And those that are earning an hourly wage, those that are subject to the scheduling demands of their employers on a regular basis. For example, someone just called in absent for their shift. I need you to come in right now. But it's Friday at 7 p.m. Well, I need you to work 5 hours or else you're not going to have a job in the near future. And there are individuals who have precarious work and they are suffering from this time poverty. And so any legislation must ensure that a 4-day work week simply does not ratchet up the pressure on workers that are most vulnerable. So there are significant justice and equity issues. Another aspect that we haven't discussed is that we are typically assuming that a 4-day work week is a 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. schedule. We haven't considered employees that work in the evening and overnight. Millions of Americans work on what we call shift work, outside the standard 9 to 5 hours. In fact, they probably aren't listening to the show now, unfortunately, because they're asleep. And so does someone who works from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., what does it mean to have a night shift in a 4-day work week? Night shift work is difficult and can cause health problems over the long term. So there are a variety of questions that need to be addressed in terms of fairness and equity regarding a 4-day work week.
Alex, you want to respond to that real quick?
Yeah, well, I think that the good news is there are plenty of places that have hourly workers that have moved to 4-day weeks. And, briefly, what you do is if you're expecting the same work out of people, then you raise people's wages. And so it hasn't been a stalking horse for giving more time to salaried workers or to management at the expense of everybody else. I do think, though, that this is something that we need to pay close attention to as the movement grows, to make sure that it remains something that is accessible to everybody, that maybe also expands the world of work for people with chronic illnesses, for example, for whom a longer workday is more of a struggle, and makes work, and therefore makes work better for everybody rather than just the few.
And before we go to break, Alex, I do want to ask, because we're talking about flexibility and how this could work in different industries. When going to a 4-day work week model, do we see any reductions in absenteeism and retention of workers? So, less turnover, maybe.
Oh yeah, big benefits there. So, with we just wrapped up a project with nurse managers in a hospital on the East Coast, and there were a couple of them who said, I had resignation letters on my desk ready to go before this trial. And the 4-day week made it possible for me to imagine having a career that I've, trained for years and really loved, but which has a lot of pressure to it. But now I can envision staying in there. And there are lots of stories of that kind, as well as indicators that smaller companies, for example, get more applicants of a higher quality or more senior people than they would otherwise. And there are tech companies that have explicitly used a 4-day week to compete with the likes of, Google or of Meta, not on salary, but rather on time. So benefits along all of those axes.
Today, we're talking about the 4-day work week and other solutions for work-life balance. I just want to share Ali on Facebook wrote to us and said, I work 4 days, 30 hours, and I'm only paid for 30 hours, but I have zero desire to work more. My husband, who works in construction, sometimes work 4 10s and sometimes 5 8s. Well, thank you so much, Ali, for sharing your experiences with us. And for our listeners, let us know if you work a 4-day work week or would like to see one. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about work-life balance and some of the solutions for addressing burnout. We just heard all about the 4-day work week, and now we're going to get into something called the right to disconnect. And still with us is Alex Pang, who's the Director of Research and Innovation at 4-Day Week Global, Lynne Vincent, Associate Professor of Management with Syracuse University, and Robert Bird, who's a Professor of Business Law with UConn. So, Lynne, I want to jump straight to you. Talk about the right to disconnect. What does that mean?
So the right to disconnect is an idea and some bills that have been introduced that say that when employees are off the clock, they are protected from having to answer emails or calls from their supervisors. When they are off the clock, they are off the clock and cannot be retaliated against during that time.
And Lynne, before the show started, we were talking about emailing, really, and how email wasn't really a thing that kept us online all the time until good internet and smartphones. And I also shared that I held on to my Motorola hot pink razor as long as I can, but obviously couldn't keep that going. So can you talk about how better internet and better cell phone access has really changed that culture?
So I have seen two shifts. I mean, I am 40, so I saw the advent and proliferation of internet and cell phones. So I am a professor. I have students emailing me all of the time at 1 a.m. And I feel that pressure to respond right away.
And Robert, I wanna come back to you relating to legislation introduced in California. You mentioned there's a bill, or there are bills in California that talks about the 4-day work week, but we also have a bill that has been introduced in California giving employees the right to disconnect. So can you tell us, what does that look like, and are we seeing any pushback on it?
Yeah, there has been some movement towards this legislation, and Lynn summarized the right to disconnect very well. And it's important because when employees do not have that right to disconnect, they do not recover as effectively and are not going to return to work as refreshed. And so a right to disconnect will enable workers to recover from their workday, take care of the personal things they need to in an uninterrupted fashion, and then come back to work being able to be fully productive and engaged in what they do. There can be some resistance. Employers might say that I have customers that need to be addressed. They have needs that need to be addressed at all hours of the day, and I need to contact you. There may be a concern that businesses may be less effective when they are not able to contact their employees outside of work. But the right to disconnect, I think, is fundamental for human beings to have. And some have even described it as a human right to be separate from one's work at a significant period of time. When an individual at home engages in a work activity on their off time, it takes a number of minutes before they can return back to that relaxation and recovery. And too many interruptions reduces the effect of that relaxation. So this is something that we can see is benefiting both employees who will have work-life balance and also employers who will have employees when they return to work fully dedicated to their tasks and responsibilities.
And so, go for it, Lynne.
I mentioned how my students email me at all times. However, I've also seen a push from them where they will have their working hours listed in their email responses. Or if I go to email them back, I get that pop-up that says, do you want to send this during their working hours? These are their work, and they tell me what their working hours are. I think that's so interesting that some of my students are setting up those boundaries,
right,
that are saying, hey, I'm not working right now. Maybe you don't have to either. But they're still emailing me at 1 a.m.
Well, everything is very, very important, and I need to know the answer right now at that era. But it is interesting that you're seeing sort of both sides of that balance. But I want to jump back to Robert really quickly too. Talking about the right to disconnect and potentially having policy written in law. How would it be enforceable by law?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the mechanisms of enforcement would be similar to those that you would see for other employment regulations, right? So employees may either report a violation, evidence may be gathered if necessary through the use of phone or other contact. And one way to avoid legal problems that companies can have is to have employees have a separate work phone and leave that work phone so it doesn't integrate with one's personal contact. Because whenever you make a call to someone outside of hours or have a text, there is a digital record of it. But really, the best conflict is the one that is resolved amicably and never actually either goes to the courts or gets government involved. And ideally, employers will be able to see the benefits of allowing their employees to disconnect and not contact them because they know when they come back, they'll be more refreshed as a result. So it could have the force of law, and there could be penalties and sanctions arising from a violation. But I would hope in most situations and in most workplaces that it never comes to that both sides will see the benefit of this separateness between the work period and also our time for rest and recovery.
Well, and I think with I was just going to say really quickly with what Robert just mentioned, because we're talking about law and policy, but maybe this is also a question about culture, right? Where can companies model after-hour communications that can be acceptable or not? And I'm assuming this is, of course, depending on the industry. Robert, is that something you can respond to real quick?
Sure. So different industries are going to handle mechanism of communications in different ways, right? So there's some jobs where you have to be present at work. And you that is your work time. And so if I'm working in retail, I'm home. There's not much I can really do for the firm. But there are some employment relationships that there'll be some real pressure to do that. So I think technology is going to help facilitate the solution because we can isolate those contacts in a way that makes work contacts through one channel and then employee contacts through another. And technology has really been a support, I think, generally for the 4-day work week, and will help reinforce the benefits of it and also help ease the transition for employers who choose to take this important step.
Alex, follow to that?
Yes. I mean, I think that on the culture issue, one of the things that we've seen is that within companies, there's a shift in mindset around the relationship between time and productivity and professional identity. That, after a few months, I had one CEO who said that, I used to hire people who I knew could stay late all the time. But now I realize someone who can do this job in 4 days rather than 6 is actually more professional than and that's what we now tell our clients and prospects, that our 4-day week is proof of how good we are, not that, we're less dedicated. It also shows us that client demands are malleable. One of the big surprises is that when you explain to clients why you're working a 4-day week, so long as they're getting the same benefit, the same work, and if there is a genuine emergency, that you will pick up the phone and deal because that's who you are, that clients are surprisingly supportive of it and often want you to succeed because maybe there are things that you can teach them that they can bring into their own workplaces. And then finally, with the technology, I think that it does play a big role. And especially if workers have control over, for example, how they use generative AI to take the less interesting, more routine parts of their jobs and essentially outsource it to a chatbot, rather allowing them to focus on the more interesting value-added stuff. So
we got about a minute and a half here left, Alex, but I still want to ask, the pandemic played a big role when it comes to the work week and the work hours, and also pushed many workers to work remotely. And now many are being told to come back to the office, either full-time or hybrid. So can you talk about how the pandemic, what role the pandemic played in terms of remote work versus 4-day work week versus, flexible schedules?
Yeah, I think that the pandemic really did two big things. One was, it raised for us a lot of questions about the place that work ought to have in our lives. And second, it showed both employers and employees that it was possible to change how we work faster and more profoundly than we ever thought possible. And I think that this has sort of given companies an impetus and I think the confidence to experiment with whether it is summer Fridays or for 10-hour days or other kinds of work weeks that, or sort of more hybrid, that often are a prelude sometimes to a 4-day week or to other kinds of permanent shifts. I think it also showed that there's an awful lot of invisible labor that we all, but especially working moms, have to engage in order to sort of make work something that works for everybody while also caring for family, dealing with school schedules, etc. And so I think that any manager who wants to flip a switch and go back to 2019 is going to encounter a lot of resistance for very good reason. And the challenge now is to figure out what combinations of hybrid, flexible, or shorter work hours work best for your industry and your company and your people. That's the challenge going forward.
Well, we're certainly looking forward to see where this goes. Thank you very much, Alex. You've been listening to Alex Pang, who's the Director of Research and Innovation at 4-Day Week Global. Thank you very much, Alex, for being with us today.
Oh, thank you, Catherine.
You're also listening to Lynne Vincent, who's Associate Professor of Management at Syracuse University. Thank you so much, Lynne, for being with us, too.
Thank you for having me.
And Robert Bird, Professor of Business Law with UConn. Appreciate your time with us today, Robert.
Thank you very much.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you very much for listening.